Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in tonight. We do have a very special tale tonight, something very near and dear to me since it comes from a local author and publisher. Stick around to the end and you can find out where to find more tales of the like. But in the meantime, sit back, put your feet up, maybe get some homework done as I tell you the tale of John S. McFarland's Janet, Please. Norman first noticed it at the founders' party 2 weeks before. It was a thought he knew he couldn't have, but one he had predicted and dreaded when he first knew Janet, long before they married. He had tried to keep busy since it appeared, tried to keep his mind preoccupied so the idea wouldn't eat at him, become an obsession, as he had let happen with other notions so many times in the past. He had to keep his thinking straight. He had a business to run and a father-in-law to keep happy, so he had to overcome distractions and irrelevant personal issues and do what he needed to do. He had to put the realization in the back of his mind and prohibit it from interfering with his growing success that he was finding his wife increasingly repellent. He needed to clear his mind of these thoughts and go back to sleep. Norman had never been a sound sleeper. As a child, he'd had night terrors, and against his pediatrician's advice, had slept in his parents' bed until he was in second grade. His terrors grew worse after his father died. Night after night, he needed to be assured by his mother that he was safe, that the mound of clothes on his bedroom chair was not a monster, and the creak of the floorboards was not a demon under his bed. He was rarely comforted by her words, though, and all that would soothe him was to follow her back to her bedroom. He never wanted her to hold his hand or touch his shoulder as he made his way with her down the hallway. He felt shame in his fears and his weakness, and her tenderness and understanding made the shame worse. As he slept next to her, he didn't want her embrace or reassuring hand on his arm. He wanted to be untouched, but not alone. "The dark can't change things, son," his mother often told him. "Whatever you think you see, the dark can't change things." Janet never had sleepless nights. In fact, it never took her more than a few minutes to fall asleep. She had begun to snore again. Norman glanced at the alarm clock. The numbers 2:15 glowed red in the dark. "Janet, please, roll over on your side," he barked. Norman was certain he never snored because he invariably slept on his left side. He had never varied from this position since he was a child. He took comfort in his habits and routines, and now his sleeping position had the added benefit facing him away from Janet. At 2:22, she was still snoring. "Janet, please, roll over on your side." There was a confused groan, a complacent sigh off in the darkness, and a rustle of sheets as Janet shifted groggily in bed. Norman thought about sarcastically asking old Una Jewel for a folk remedy to stop the snoring, since Janet placed such absurd, superstitious trust in the old woman's cures. "I love you, Norman." The words were mumbled in her sleep. In a few moments, she was breathing heavily again. Norman smiled a little. "I wonder how much she will love me in a month from now," he mumbled quietly. The thought immediately made him a little ashamed of himself. He really didn't want to hurt her or cause her any pain. He just knew he was quickly reaching a point where he couldn't tolerate her anymore. Once her father was gone, and the old man had just turned 96, Norman could leave her behind. He would have controlling interest in her family's plastic business. She would be provided for, and he could move on with his plans for the company. The founders' party was just the latest incident. Norman's butyrate supplier threw a big summer party for customers at the Marriott every year. This year, for the first time in her life as far as Norman knew, Janet got drunk. It was bad enough she had worn that ridiculous sailor dress. He asked her not to, but somehow she had got it into her head that Norman secretly liked the dress, in spite of his claims otherwise, so she wore it anyway. All evening, Norman tried to make conversation with his supplier, his purchaser, and his production supervisor, but he watched Janet as she worked her way around the banquet hall, and he panicked a little when she ordered a third margarita. She had gained a lot of weight in the last few years. Her sweet tooth had only gotten worse as she got older, and her sense of balance seemed to be declining as her body mass increased. He would have to find a way to discreetly take her aside and tell her not to drink anymore. "Norman loves this dress," he heard her say. She was behind him now, talking to a group of women that included Donita, his assistant, and 2 of his saleswomen. "He says he doesn't love it because it makes me look young, younger than him. But I've seen how he looks at me in it. He's just like a little boy. You know how they can't really hide how they feel about something when they want to fool you." Norman knew the time was now to take Janet aside. As he turned to face her, she crashed into him in a seismic, flopping embrace. The force threw him backwards onto the dessert table with Janet on top of him. He cut his ear on the edge of the table, and with her weight on top of him, he could not breathe for several seconds. When she saw what she had done, she burst into tears. She blubbered helplessly as he picked himself up, gathered her coat and purse, and drove her home. "I just wanted to give you a big hug," she sobbed. "I wanted to surprise you with a big hug. You haven't let me hug you for 6 years. For 6 years you haven't." She prodded him contritely. Her touch made him shiver and disgusted him a little. He refused to reassure her immediately. Whenever she embarrassed him in public, he never forgave her right away. "Janet, please," he said. "I want you to leave me alone and go to bed. I don't want to talk about this." She reached for him again, but he brushed her hand away. "But, Please." Janet liked to say how she knew Norman loved her. Knew it even if he didn't know or admit it to himself. She said this to him the very day she met Una Jewel and first asked for her help, as she told Norman later. The old woman had come to the back door one afternoon in early summer. She was malnourished and exhausted. She asked for kitchen work, but told Janet that she had been directed there by voices in the ether who told her that she was needed by the household. Janet's Pomeranian, Maisie, barked non-stop at the old woman and nipped her leg several times. Una kicked at the dog twice, but Janet didn't seem to notice. Always superstitious, Janet was curious about Una's voices, and being soft-hearted, she gave the old woman the apartment above the carriage house at the end of their drive. In explaining Una's presence to Norman that night, Janet said she could see that the old woman's strength was gone, and she couldn't imagine being old, alone and penniless in the world. Janet helped Una up to the apartment and into the chair by the front window overlooking the drive. Maisie nipped and barked at Una the entire time, and Janet admitted to Norman she did very little to calm the dog down and keep her away. Janet left the little dog barking outside when she came back to the kitchen to make Una a sandwich. Suddenly, the barking stopped, and Janet assumed Maisie had found a squirrel or a lizard to chase. There was no sign of the dog when Janet brought a ham sandwich and a glass of lemonade back to Una, who was still sitting by the window in her front room.
"I have no family anymore,"
Una said in a weak and breaking voice, and in an accent Janet could not identify.
"I want to be honest with you. Since you're a kind person, I come up from the Bayou Shannon, from the Atchafalaya. I ran for it or the Gilrys would have killed me. Bad family. I was a traitor and a metamorph, and I put a chicken head hex on one of them, Judd. First I make him become the evil thing, the monster he really was inside. I change him so the whole world can see, but he didn't last too long after that. he die. And they come for me. I want you to know this before you take me in.
Oh my, Janet said. Well, that is so interesting. I bet you have some stories to tell. None of that matters to me. Judge not, lest ye be judged. There's two sides to every story, as they say. You just rest, and when you're better, we'll find some work for you to do here.
I thank you, missus. I thank you. Beaucoup, beaucoup.
Janet sat with Una until the old lady had dozed off in the chair. Janet whistled and called for Maisie as she walked back to the kitchen, but the little dog was nowhere to be found. The next morning, as Norman was backing his new truck out of the driveway, he felt a little jolt and heard a muffled crunch as he rolled over something. He got out of the truck. His left rear tire had crushed the head and front legs of an animal he could not identify. It was smooth skin and wet and looked something like a large hellbend or salamander. But the tail was too short, and it appeared to have fur around its neck. What the holy hell, he mumbled. He pulled the truck up a bit, scraped up the carcass with a shovel, and dumped it in a trash can. Norman had never seen anything like the creature before. He assumed that his tire smashed its head and front legs in such a way that its normal morphology was unrecognizable. As he got back into the truck, he noticed Una standing at her apartment window, looking down at him. She seemed to smile a little and nodded, then disappeared back into her room. Norman was glad he removed the creature before Janet saw it. It was too early in the morning for her hysterics. That evening, Janet invited Una to have dinner with them. Norman objected to this, but didn't say anything. Things would be difficult for his wife soon. He felt he could indulge her a little. Did Maisie ever come back? Norman said as Janet served her tuna casserole.
Doug won't be back, missus,
Una said.
I got a feeling of it. Sorry, but I feel that dog ain't coming back.
Norman thought he saw the same expression on the old woman's face he had seen that morning. How do you know that, Una? Norman asked. How do you know the dog won't be back? Una looked at Norman coldly and fixedly. After a few moments of her gaze, he looked away from her, towards Janet.
I am given to know,
Una said.
And as a metamorph, I know the means of changes of things to a more suitable form, more befitting a form to the true nature of the thing. Those ugly on the inside can be made ugly on the outside. That's what they brings on thyself when I am near. Those that have strength inside, like you wife here, can be made to show strength on the outside.
Well, I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about or what that has to do with the dog, Norman smiled. But very interesting, I'm sure. Janet tells me you're sort of a wildcrafter, an herbalist? Oh, yes, she is, Janet nodded. I just find that so interesting. I would love to know more, to see if any of that really works. I think you already know my opinion, Janet, Norman said. My grandma was an herbalist out of the Saline Creek. So many smells I remember as a kid out at her place. I was always interested to visit her and see what she was up to. Scared me a little, though. Even at 7 or 8, I was pretty sure it was nonsense. But maybe not completely sure. No offense, ladies. Una was still staring at Norman and continued to do so until he left the dining room. Norman needed to put all thoughts of Una and Janet and his business problems out of his mind and get some sleep, even if it were just an hour or two. Norman rolled over in his bed. The dial on the alarm clock read 2:45. His mind was getting too active now, and he knew he may never go back to sleep. Nothing unusual. He had lots of nights like this. A few days after she took Una in, Janet gave the old woman a few light housework duties to do and had her working in the yard and garden, weeding and trimming on days when it wasn't too hot. Last Friday, Norman got home late. It had been a rough week. He had lost a big automotive component account to Kreitz Compounding in Frankfurt. and an afternoon-long meeting with his sales staff and purchaser had convinced him that they couldn't undercut Kreitz's price to get the business back without eliminating the third shift of production. Norman was sitting at the dinner table going over the minutes of the meeting when Janet walked quietly into the room. Even though it was a warm night, she was wearing her flannel nightgown that read, "Sometimes I wake up crabby. Sometimes I let him sleep late," on the front. She seemed tentative and a little embarrassed. "I have some little jars in the kitchen. Tiny little jars. Had marmalade and jelly samples in them." She did not look at him as she spoke. "Janet, please. I'm busy here." "Una's going to help us. Help us get close again." "We were never that close, Janet. It's not who I am, you know that." "I know you don't believe in these things, but I think it's worth a try. If we give Una some secretions, which I have done already, body secretions and skin flakes, she can help us. She can make a filter that will make us close again. She swears she can. She says I must demand my happiness. Demand it in this marriage." "Janet, go to bed. That's nonsense. Disgusting nonsense, and I won't be party to it. And I think we have done all we need to do for Una Jewel. Give her a few days, and then get her out of here. Send her to the women's shelter or Harbor Light. I don't want her around here anymore." This morning, Saturday, as he was reorganizing his garage and painting the garden tool shed, he noticed a smell, a sour, nauseating odor following him around. In one of the extra pockets of his painter's overalls, he found a sachet of asafoetida and henbane and other things he had seen and smelled at his grandmother's house when he was a child, all stuffed into a small cloth pouch. Disgusted, Norman didn't speak to Janet for the rest of the afternoon. He only relented after hours of her whimpering and remorse because she was making herself sick, and her self-abasement became irritating to the point of distraction. He forgave her on the condition that she remove Una Jewel from the carriage house by noon the next day. When Janet put her hand on his shoulder in gratitude and mewed for a reassuring embrace, Norman's whole body shuddered. The clock read 3:15. This night is never going to end, Norman thought. Janet's breathing had become loud enough to be distracting again. He tried to think of business. He knew his company's contract with North American Digital was also in jeopardy from Kreitz, and that account would be their next target. He had to come up with a pricing strategy. Norman awoke suddenly with a sensation of falling. He was still on his left side. He wondered how long he had slept. The clock read 3:43. The smell of asafoetida was in the room, and he wondered if it would ever leave the house. Maybe it was time for him to move out. He could rent a townhouse overlooking the river and leave all this behind. Best to wait until his father-in-law was gone. It wouldn't be long now. Norman heard movement behind him. "I'm on my path, Norman," Janet said. Her voice was a coarse whisper. "I love you, Norman." "I know you do, Janet. I know." Gradually, Norman became aware that the whole room seemed to be full and resounding with Janet's breathing, that her breath was on the back of his head and neck, and that it was stale and voluminous, making his hair wave like a wheat field in the wind. "Janet, please." The smell of the asafoetida was starting to make him sick. It was the smell he hated the most when he visited his grandmother's house so long ago. But the smell, he remembered, should be gone. He had washed down all the furniture that afternoon and washed all the bedclothes. "I love you, Norman. My path is only to love you. You must accept this, Una says. I must demand it of you, Una says." Norman could feel her body against his back, but it was cold and huge and unyielding. It seemed to extend beyond his both at the head and feet. Then he remembered that as of last month, they had twin beds. And I demand it. Janet, what are you doing in my bed? Something like an arm fell over him, but it was huge and heavy, nearly as heavy, it seemed to him in that instant, as his whole body. He remembered his mother telling him that the dark can't change things. I love you, Norman. Yes. Janet, I know. Please. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our short read tonight. This one, as I said before, is a little more special to me, as both the author and the publisher are local to Arizona. I would like to give special thanks to Jonas McFarland for letting me read his short story here, and I would also like to thank Dark Owl Publishing for letting me read this story as well. Tonight's short story came from a collection of terrifying tales entitled The Dark Walk Forward. You can find this anthology on their website, darkowlpublishing.com. You can find it on Amazon and in select local stores, such as The Terror Trader and Chandler AZ. But again, thank you listeners for tuning in. And that's our one last thing for tonight. I hope you all enjoyed. Sleep well, rest up, and remember, enjoy some R&R.